victims of that racial profiling. Their families had been the victims of the housing inequity, but they had never had a person in a position of authority, least of all the white man in a position of authority, look them dead in the eye and tell them, that thing you think is happening, yeah, that's happening, partner. You're not hallucinating. So now what are we going to do about it? See, when you ratify the truth of young people, when you ratify the truth that they and their families know, and you make the learning relevant to their everyday routine, they will amaze you with what they can do. But this system doesn't want us to do that, which is why that teacher then had to go in front of the school board and explain himself. And they told him, you can't tell the children that somebody's trying to kill them. He said, why not? He said, well, we have other ways of reaching them. And he said, really? Because I've been doing this job for an awful lot of years and I haven't found another one. This one worked. Education for liberation. I was speaking at a conference in Minnesota a couple years back, and it was a conference for schools that had been specifically, and it was a charter thing, and I'm very, right? But these particular charter operators had this sort of social justice-oriented mission. I said, you know what? If they're going to have these things, I'm going to go talk to them. It'd be stupid not to, right? So I go up there, and these particular schools were serving a population that was about 1/3 unhoused, homeless folk, right? And almost all poor, not all of color, but disproportionately so, including some poor white folks. And I went in, and I'm the last speaker of the day. And I'm watching the other speakers that they brought in, and these other speakers are sort of giving the old, pull your pants up, get your shit together routine, right? Basically lecturing the kids like us old folks sometimes are wont to do, right? Stop listening to that music, It's like the old man in Dennis the Menace, whatever his name was, like, get off my lawn, whatever, right? And they're all sort of doing that routine, it's sort of that boot camp, get it together, you can be anything you want, if you just get it together. And so all these kids, 1/3 of them don't have a place to live. And here's people telling them, you can be anything if you just work hard, which is another way of saying, in effect, there must be something wrong with you because you ain't making it right now. Think about the message that we send when we offer that line to them, supposedly to incentivize hard work, but really what it does is make them reflect on their current condition and figure out that they must be damaged. So I get up, and these young folks have got their heads on the table, right? They're not listening. They got the headphones on. They're totally checked out. And I'm thinking, what in the name of God is this 42-year-old, whatever I was at the time, middle-aged white man from Nashville going to tell these folks? So I got up, and I said, I just want to start off by apologizing to you. On behalf of this country, they have not authorized me to apologize, but I'm going to do it. Because we lied to you when we told you that you could be anything you wanted if you just worked hard enough. I know it's a lie because right now black folk with a college degree are still twice as likely to be unemployed compared to white folks with one. Latino folk with a degree are still 60% more likely than white folks with a degree to be unemployed. Asian American folk with a degree, 25% more likely than white folk with a degree to be unemployed. Our indigenous brothers and sisters, 3/4 more likely. So we lied to you. And all of a sudden these young folks who've been checked out, right? Their heads come up off the desk, the headphones come off, and they look at each other, and I can read lips, right? This one dude looks at his buddy, and he's like, pardon the expression, but he says, what is this shit? And shit as in good, not as in bad, folks. So just got to keep up with the lingo, right? What is this shit? And the other guy goes, I don't know, but he takes out a piece of paper, and now he's writing down notes, right? Because all this, and again, it's not because I'm such a genius and I told them something they didn't know. But they never had somebody in a position of authority look them in the eye and tell them they are not the ones who have lost their mind, that the system has lost its mind, and that we have to upturn the system in order to get back to justice. Education as liberation. That's the choice that we have before us. We have to view our jobs as educators, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's counselors at a school, whether it's various types of administrators and classified staff, whether it's people like me who just travel around and speak to young people. We're all educators in one way or the other, or even in our own homes, with our own children, you see. We have to explain to them how we got to this place, because, the one thing that we're all raised with in this society, and it's the most dangerous thing, is that ideology I just mentioned, that notion of meritocracy, rugged individualism, right? Because if you're raised to believe that wherever you end up is all about your own effort, and then you look around and you see the inequities that exist, it almost becomes rational, doesn't it? to default to the position that says, well, there must be something wrong with those brown and black children. And there must be something wrong with those poor children, regardless of race. And there must be something wrong with women relative to men because they occupy the bottom of the ladder economically as well, disproportionately. In other words, racism and classism and sexism end up being almost rational in a society where you're taught to believe that wherever you end up is all about you, right? So if we don't explain the complexity of that ideology, if we don't interrogate it, because we know it's not real, we've all had help. Some of that help was color-coded, some of that was class-based, some of that was gender-based, some of that was about being straight or cisgendered, some of that was just about luck. There are no rugged individuals, and we'll destroy this society if we continue to teach that there are. There's no such thing, first of all, as an individual in the history of the human species. Individuals don't live in isolation. We've always been social beings, communal beings. If you ever meet someone who's a rugged individual, you need to run like hell from that thing. Because they will be dangerous. They'll be feral like a wild animal. Be like somebody raised on an island by a porpoise. They will not have language. They will probably try and eat you because no one would have taught them of the taboo of such a thing. See, there are no individuals. We've all had help. We've all had luck, right? We've all had people that have come into our lives as mentors or as teachers and made us the people who we are today. But unless we carry that story forward, these young people who we educate grow up thinking there's something wrong with them, right? Thinking that the reason that they're struggling is there's something wrong with them or wrong with their families. And then sometimes, even when we mean well as educators, I know there's a lot of rhetoric within the schooling world that people will say things like, you gotta stay in school so that you can get out of your neighborhood, of your community, right? So you can get out. Think about the message we send when we say that. What are we saying when we say the purpose of education is so you can get out? We're saying everything you come from is wrong. Everyone you come from is wrong and flawed and damaged. Your mama, your dad, your tia, all of them flawed. You need to get away from them as quickly as you can and never look back. That's how people internalize their own sense of self-hatred in this country. We have to be honest. We have to tell the truth. And we have to decide that the education of young people is a revolutionary act. It is not what we do for the likes of the Hospital Corporation of America or Walmart, right? It is not for Walmart that we educate our young children. There's nothing wrong with working there, but there is something wrong with a system that pays the workers at Walmart so little that they have to turn to us, the taxpayers, to subsidize their low wages with SNAP benefits because the company, one of the wealthiest in the history of the world, doesn't want to pay them enough. Think about the irony. This incredibly wealthy company whose 6 principal heirs have the same amount of net worth as the bottom 40% of the American population. Let me repeat, 6 people with the same net worth.
Dr. Tim Wise is trying to unveil the truth about the education of the United States and how the elites are always trying to make everyone in the dark. Remember, Dr. Tim Wise is a social critic and often points out how education in the United States has been shaped not for full human development, but for individuals who rather to serve the interest of corporate power. And his critiques suggest that schools have been restructured to train workers for the needs of the market instead of nurturing citizens with critical thinking skills, cultural awareness, and self-actualization. This is especially damaging because it reduces education to a pipeline for labor rather than a path to liberation. With this dynamic reflects all Americans, Black people have been historically seen or have been at the sharpest end of it, as the education has been systematically designed to limit rather than expand their potential. Join me in today's discussion as you watch this video as we unravel the truth. I'm your host and presenter, G Stories, and let's get into it. I'll be back and my thoughts in regards to this.
Hello, thank you very much. It is an honor to be here. I'm glad that I was able to make it in spite of the weather. It has been an incredibly difficult week for me in terms of travel. I started out in Fargo and I was headed to, which is funny enough, right? Actually Grand Forks, but then flew out of Fargo to go to Columbia, Missouri, got diverted, ended up in Kansas City. They lost my bags, all of this weather related. Then I was headed here. Last night, everything was delayed coming out of Salt Lake. Wasn't sure if I was going to make it. I thought perhaps there was a conspiracy that perhaps Donald Trump had bought up all the weather and he was going to rename it. It will no longer be called weather. It will just be called Trump now. But apparently, the fates were on our side, and I was able to make it in last night, and I'm glad to be able to share some thoughts with you. I don't have a lot of time, so I will jump right into it and dispense with all the perfunctory thank yous, but just know that I am indeed thanking everyone who made it possible for me to come. I want to start off by saying that if you do not remember another thing that I say today, and I hope that you will, it's only 30 minutes, it really shouldn't be that tough to recall, but if you remember nothing else, remember this, and I think it is a maxim that we can live by whenever we look out and see inequalities in our society, whether they are economic, educational, disparities in housing, disparities in wealth and income, disparities in the justice system. The maxim is this: there are no accidents, only precedents. And what I mean by that is that when we see inequities in our society, we sometimes assume that something has gone wrong, that the system is broken down, and we can't figure out what it is that's created them. But remember, there are no accidents, only precedents. That is to say, things that preceded what we can witness with our own eyes today. And if we know what those things are, then we can move forward with intentionality to create real equity. If we are unclear about what those precedents are, we will continue to spin our wheels to no effect. So here you are, educators, folks who work in the field of education so critical to the development of the next generation of leaders in this country. And you know, I hope, and if you don't, you're about to, that the system of which you were a part has a precedent of having been set up not for equality, not for justice, but for inequity on purpose. This is not meant as a conspiracy theory. It is what sociologists call functionalism. That is to say, systems look the way they look because they work for the people who count and have the power. They don't work for others, but the others don't have the power to change them. This is not accident, this is precedent. If you understand that, then you have the option to become not just a teacher, not just a staff member in a school trying to do right by children. You have the option to become a revolutionary, upending that system. But you got to understand where that system came from. So let's take it back a ways. Let's look at the evidence to suggest that these inequities are deliberate that you face. The attack on teachers, the deprofessionalization of education, the attempt to privatize it and to move away from public education as an institution. It all has a long history. It was never intended, schooling in this country, to bring about equity. We know that. Thomas Jefferson told us as much. See, here's a man who, for whatever reason, is still revered as an educational philosophy icon. He founded the University of Virginia, for goodness sake. Don't you know he loved him some learning? And yet, what Thomas Jefferson said, his own words, were that we ought to have 3 years of compulsory schooling so that we can, his words, not mine, rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. In other words, the purpose of schooling was not to be the great equalizer, which is what we like to call it today for reasons I cannot fathom, because it doesn't do that and it never has done that. But Thomas Jefferson was telling us over 200 years ago that that was not its purpose. The purpose of schooling was to rake a few geniuses from the rubbish, the implicit assumption being most people are rubbish and they will work for the elite. It wasn't education as an equalizer, it was education as an unequalizer. Fast forward, over 100 years later, Woodrow Wilson, also thought of as this amazing educational theorist of the early 20th century. Before he was president of the United States, as you know, he was president of Princeton. And during that time, as he was fashioning his educational philosophies and spreading them to others in the profession, he said that what we really needed was one group of individuals to prepare themselves for the receipt of a liberal education, that being the term that they used to use for college, and another group, much larger, he said, by necessity in every society, that would forego the privilege of a liberal or college education and prepare themselves for the performance of certain difficult manual tasks. In other words, updating Jefferson, but not by much. The goal of education, not equity, Not equality, but inequity and inequality on purpose. Some getting education, some not. The ones who don't will work for those who do. Again, not an accident, a precedent. Fast forward to the late 90s, and I'm sitting around on a Sunday afternoon watching one of the talk shows. And who happens to be a guest that day but William Bennett, who you will recall was both the director of the Department of Education and the drug czar, both of which jobs he did so splendidly. Right? And he's being interviewed, and they asked him, what's the biggest problem in education today? And he had a lot of things from which he could have chosen. Yes, I mean, he could have chosen underfunding. He could have chosen runaway cost of college education, a lack of adequate preparation for teachers because they don't get the support they need to be able to do their job. He could have talked about academic tracking, the overuse of standardized tests on unstandardized students. He could have talked about any of those things, but he talked about none of them. When they asked him, what's the biggest problem in education today? He looked right in the camera and without irony or any sense of misgiving, updating the words of Thomas Jefferson, updating the words of Woodrow Wilson, said the following. He said, the biggest problem with education today is that too many people are going to college. And I was waiting, because you know how sometimes when you speak, your voice catches and you've got something else, but you sort of choke on the words. And it's like the verbal equivalent of an internal ellipsis when you write it out. It's like a dot, dot, dot. I thought maybe there was a dot, dot, dot coming. Like maybe he was going to say, too many people are going to college, who can't afford to go. Like that would have been fine. But he had nothing else. That was it. There was no comma at the end of the phrase. It was a period. And I thought, well, my goodness, what does he mean? And then I started to think about it. And what he meant was the same thing Woodrow Wilson meant, the same thing Thomas Jefferson meant, that certain people ought not prepare themselves for college, but for the performance of certain difficult manual tasks that the rest of us apparently are too good to do. It was the logic of the slaveholder. The logic that says if they all learn to read, who's going to pick this cotton? And in an updated sense, if they all learn to read, who's going to pick that produce? If they all learn to read, if they all go to college, who's going to clean the hotel rooms where I slept tonight and all of this week? Who's going to empty the bedpans in the hospitals? Because we have decided that that work is to be done by those who we deem less important and pay them accordingly, as opposed to the pharmaceutical sales rep who lives 3 doors down from me, or the derivatives traders on Wall Street, who if they don't show up to work for a month, you know what, life will go on. But if the guys that pick up my garbage don't show up for 3 weeks, we have epidemics on our block. And if the teachers and the educators of this country don't show up for 3 months, the whole society falls apart. But we understand that we've created a system that is not about education for liberation. It is about education for job training, and only within an economic order that prioritizes the needs of the haves over the have-nots. So we have a choice to make. Whether we're going to ratify the system the way Bill Bennett sees it, the way Thomas Jefferson and Woodrow Wilson saw it, which is as a system to produce inequality and to slot people in to a system that is preordained to benefit some and not the rest, or whether we are going to view education as liberation, because those are the only two choices. One will either liberate young people in an educational system that is turned upside down and changed for the benefit of all, educators and the educated, or we will continue to perpetuate this inequality that was created very much on purpose. And we can see it all over the country. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, and the high school that I attended in the last 20 to 25 years or so has transformed into what they now like to call a career academy. Now, what is this career academy exactly? It is a career academy. It is actually referred to as a healthcare industry career academy. Now, there is nothing wrong, by the way, with preparing folks for good and decent jobs with which they can support a family. But notice, they're not trying to prepare people to be doctors and nurses. They're trying to prepare people to work in a privatized healthcare industry that puts profit above the health of this country's people. They are preparing them for the perpetuation of a system that isn't about justice. That's education as job training, not education as liberation. That's not education that is engaged in the development of critical thinking citizens of the world. It is about meeting the needs of the Hospital Corporation of America, whose headquarters are about 3 miles away from that high school. And they need pencil pushers, and they need insurance adjusters, and they need price adjusters, and they need people with MBAs to try to figure out how to cut healthcare costs. So that's what they want to educate these young people for. And the teachers who are caught up in that system have so little power to fight back against it, as you well know, that you end up becoming part of a machine that you don't control, let alone own. And those young people certainly don't control it. So we have made a choice in this society, at least some have, those at the top, the elite, have made a choice, just as they've chosen to create an economy where almost all the jobs or all the income increase in the last 9 or 10 years has gone to the top 1%, the vast majority of it to the top 1/10 of 1%. The bottom 90% have seen their wages drop, new jobs paying 23% less on average than the jobs that were lost during the recession. So when we say we are preparing people for career-ready education, we are talking about careers in an economy that is rooted in inequity and injustice. We can do better than that, and we must do better than that, and we must reclaim the purpose of education as liberation, as a revolutionary act. But yet all around the country, we also see folks trying to do that, see? There are signs on the horizon that there are folks who are woken to this. They realize what the real situation is and what it entails. You got these young people and their teachers and their staff members who have been fighting for La Raza Studies out in Tucson, this amazing Mexican-American studies program that the state of Arizona shut down because they said it was teaching hatred, to talk to Chicano and Chicana children about the history of their region, as if A, they didn't know that their land got taken, and as if B, knowing the truth would somehow turn them against America, turn them against white folks. It would sow racial division. See how that works? The history of land theft isn't what created division. The history of racism isn't what created the division. Talking about the history of racism is what created the division. That's like blaming your speedometer for the speeding ticket that you just got this morning. But that program was working. See, it was about education as liberation. We know it was working because the students who went through the program, they could control and do a study where they looked at the Latino kids in particular, right, who went through La Raza Studies and compared them to the Latino and Latina kids in the system who didn't enroll in La Raza Studies and see what the outcomes were. What were they? You've seen some of this data, I'm sure. The students who went through the program were going on to college at a rate of over 70%. And the kids from the same demographic and cultural grouping who weren't going through the program only were going to college at a rate of 17%. See, they didn't get rid of this program because it wasn't working. They got rid of this program because it was. No accidents, just precedents. But at least we know that work is being done and that fight continues. It continues all over the country. It continues in places like Seattle where brave teachers are standing up and saying, just as they did a couple of years ago, we're not going to teach these absurd tests to these children. We're not going to subject them to this ridiculous standardization regime, and you can punish us if you want, but now you can't fire us all. And when they stood in solidarity at Garfield and other schools and made that point, by God, guess who backed down? It wasn't them, you see. That tells you what solidaristic action can get us. Those who are committed to education as liberation can make that difference. But there's always pushback, right? Because when you try to educate for liberation, those who benefit from the system as it is are mightily concerned. There was a teacher outside of Denver a couple years ago, Cherry Creek, right, suburban area outside of Denver, read this story about him. He's a white guy, been teaching math. He's teaching students of color, and he noticed that the black kids in his class, right, they just weren't doing as well, but he knew they were capable. He knew they were bright. He refused to believe what the system was telling him, that they couldn't be taught and they didn't want to learn. So he went into the class one day, and he goes up to the chalkboard or the whiteboard, whatever they use now, I don't know. Haven't been in a classroom in a minute, right? Went up to the board, starts writing all these numbers on the board, right? And he doesn't say anything to the kids, and now they're getting restless, right? The students are sitting there thinking, oh, is this going to be on the test? What is this, right? Right? Which is what every 15-year-old, 13-year-old wants to know. And it's all these number stuff they've never seen before, tables, data, charts, graphs, right? It takes him like 10, 15 minutes to finish writing it. And when he's over, he turns around. They say, what is that? He points to the board and he says, this right here is evidence that someone is trying to kill you. And the kids went, wait, what? What do you mean somebody's trying to kill us? And he goes over and starts explaining what the numbers mean. He says, this right here is the data on wealth disparity in the greater Denver area. This right here are the incarceration rate differences between white folks and folks of color. This right here are the income gaps, the unemployment gaps, the data on racial profiling and police stops. In other words, he was demonstrating to them the algebra of inequality, the calculus of oppression, and all of a sudden these young people had a fire lit under them because why? The teacher had made math and numbers, data relevant to their everyday life, education as liberation, not as job preparation. So these young people all of a sudden went from getting F's and D's to getting A's and B's. They created a mentoring group for younger kids of color to explain to them the social significance of math. It wasn't that teacher told those young black folks anything they didn't know. They already knew. They'd been the victims of that racial profiling. Their families had been the victims of the housing inequity, but they had never had a person in a position of authority, least of all the white man in a position of authority, look them dead in the eye and tell them, that thing you think is happening, yeah, that's happening, partner. You're not hallucinating. So now what are we going to do about it? See, when you ratify the truth of young people, when you ratify the truth that they and their families know, and you make the learning relevant to their everyday routine, they will amaze you with what they can do. But this system doesn't want us to do that, which is why that teacher then had to go in front of the school board and explain himself. And they told him, you can't tell the children that somebody's trying to kill them. He said, why not? He said, well, we have other ways of reaching them. And he said, really? Because I've been doing this job for an awful lot of years and I haven't found another one. This one worked. Education for liberation. I was speaking at a conference in Minnesota a couple years back, and it was a conference for schools that had been specifically, and it was a charter thing, and I'm very, right? But these particular charter operators had this sort of social justice-oriented mission. I said, you know what? If they're going to have these things, I'm going to go talk to them. It'd be stupid not to, right? So I go up there, and these particular schools were serving a population that was about 1/3 unhoused, homeless folk, right? And almost all poor, not all of color, but disproportionately so, including some poor white folks. And I went in, and I'm the last speaker of the day. And I'm watching the other speakers that they brought in, and these other speakers are sort of giving the old, pull your pants up, get your shit together routine, right? Basically lecturing the kids like us old folks sometimes are wont to do, right? Stop listening to that music, It's like the old man in Dennis the Menace, whatever his name was, like, get off my lawn, whatever, right? And they're all sort of doing that routine, it's sort of that boot camp, get it together, you can be anything you want, if you just get it together. And so all these kids, 1/3 of them don't have a place to live. And here's people telling them, you can be anything if you just work hard, which is another way of saying, in effect, there must be something wrong with you because you ain't making it right now. Think about the message that we send when we offer that line to them, supposedly to incentivize hard work, but really what it does is make them reflect on their current condition and figure out that they must be damaged. So I get up, and these young folks have got their heads on the table, right? They're not listening. They got the headphones on. They're totally checked out. And I'm thinking, what in the name of God is this 42-year-old, whatever I was at the time, middle-aged white man from Nashville going to tell these folks? So I got up, and I said, I just want to start off by apologizing to you. On behalf of this country, they have not authorized me to apologize, but I'm going to do it. Because we lied to you when we told you that you could be anything you wanted if you just worked hard enough. I know it's a lie because right now black folk with a college degree are still twice as likely to be unemployed compared to white folks with one. Latino folk with a degree are still 60% more likely than white folks with a degree to be unemployed. Asian American folk with a degree, 25% more likely than white folk with a degree to be unemployed. Our indigenous brothers and sisters, 3/4 more likely. So we lied to you. And all of a sudden these young folks who've been checked out, right? Their heads come up off the desk, the headphones come off, and they look at each other, and I can read lips, right? This one dude looks at his buddy, and he's like, pardon the expression, but he says, what is this shit? And shit as in good, not as in bad, folks. So just got to keep up with the lingo, right? What is this shit? And the other guy goes, I don't know, but he takes out a piece of paper, and now he's writing down notes, right? Because all this, and again, it's not because I'm such a genius and I told them something they didn't know, But they never had somebody in a position of authority look them in the eye and tell them they are not the ones who have lost their mind, that the system has lost its mind, and that we have to upturn the system in order to get back to justice. Education as liberation. That's the choice that we have before us. We have to view our jobs as educators, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's counselors at a school, whether it's various types of administrators and classified staff, whether it's people like me who just travel around and speak to young people. We're all educators in one way or the other, even in our own homes, with our own children. You see, we have to explain to them how we got to this place, because the one thing that we're all raised with in this society, and it's the most dangerous thing, is that ideology I just mentioned, that notion of meritocracy, rugged individualism, right? Because if you're raised to believe that wherever you end up is all about your own effort, and then you look around and you see the inequities that exist, it almost becomes rational, doesn't it, to default to the position that says, well, there must be something wrong with those brown and black children. And there must be something wrong with those poor children, regardless of race. And there must be something wrong with women relative to men, because they occupy the bottom of the ladder economically as well, disproportionately. In other words, racism and classism and sexism end up being almost rational in a society where you're taught to believe that wherever you end up is all about you, right? So if we don't explain the complexity of that ideology, if we don't interrogate it, because we know it's not real, we've all had help. Some of that help was color-coded, some of that was class-based, some of that was gender-based, some of that was about being straight or cisgendered, some of that was just about luck. There are no rugged individuals, and we'll destroy this society if we continue to teach that there are. There's no such thing, first of all, as an individual in the history of the human species. Individuals don't live in isolation. We've always been social beings, communal beings. If you ever meet someone who's a rugged individual, you need to run like hell from that thing, because they will be dangerous. They'll be feral, like a wild animal. Be like somebody raised on an island by a porpoise. They will not have language. They will probably try and eat you, because no one would have taught them of the taboo of such a thing. See, there are no individuals. We've all had help. We've all had luck, right? We've all had people that have come into our lives as mentors or as teachers and made us the people who we are today. But unless we carry that story forward, these young people who we educate grow up thinking there's something wrong with them, right? Thinking that the reason that they're struggling is there's something wrong with them or wrong with their families. And then sometimes, even when we mean well as educators, I know there's a lot of rhetoric within the schooling world that people will say things like, you gotta stay in school so that you can get out of your neighborhood, of your community, right? So you can get out. Think about the message we send when we say that. What are we saying when we say the purpose of education is so you can get out? We're saying everything you come from is wrong. Everyone you come from is wrong and flawed and damaged. Your mama, your dad, your tia, all of them flawed. You need to get away from them as quickly as you can and never look back. That's how people internalize their own sense of self-hatred in this country. We have to be honest. We have to tell the truth. And we have to decide that the education of young people is a revolutionary act. It is not what we do for the likes of the Hospital Corporation of America or Walmart, right? It is not for Walmart that we educate our young children. There's nothing wrong with working there, but there is something wrong with a system that pays the workers at Walmart so little that they have to turn to us, the taxpayers, to subsidize their low wages with SNAP benefits, because the company, one of the wealthiest in the history of the world, doesn't want to pay them enough. Think about the irony. This incredibly wealthy company whose 6 principal heirs have the same amount of net worth as the bottom 40% of the American population. Let me repeat, 6 people with the same net worth as the bottom 127 million Americans, paying their workers so little that they have to turn to us as taxpayers to give them food stamps to supplement their incomes, which are already so low. And then where do those workers redeem their food stamps, pray tell? At Walmart, $13.5 billion a year worth of SNAP redemption. That's our problem, is an educational and an economic system predicated on inequity. If we want that system to change, we have to educate for a different purpose. And we have to demand not only that our children understand the importance of education as a liberatory and a revolutionary act, but that our teachers and our staff and everyone who walks into a school knows that that's the work, that this is revolutionary activity. It is not career training. It is not making people ready for careers, though it may have that salutary benefit. It is about teaching folks how to think and how to change the society in front of them. Because if we do not do that, we end up on this path that we see ourselves on now in terms of not only education, but economics and everything else. Sometimes I ask folks, if you wanted to create a system that was racist institutionally, but you couldn't let on that that's what you were doing, if you had to create policies and practices and procedures that would have the effect of generating racial injustice, but you had to be slick about it because it's not legal, so you got to be careful. You can't get caught. What would you do? What policies would you create? And you know what policies folks come up with? All the ones we actually have in place right now. Whether it's the way that we fund our schools, whether it's the way that we use standardized tests on unstandardized children and then call that justice, whether it's the way that we seek to privatize institutions, whether it's the unequal academic tracking, unequal discipline, all these things that happen in schools every day are the very things you would do if you were trying to create a racist and unjust system. So what does that tell us? We have a system to take apart. We cannot just tinker around the edges. We cannot just get a little more funding for this program or a little more funding for that program or a cut here or an addition there, though we need those things. What we must also do is create or go back to, not create, go back to that paradigm of education that always manifested within communities of color, particularly black communities under segregation. Teresa Perry talks about it in her work. Right? She talks about education and the black experience being freedom for literacy and literacy for freedom. Right? That the purpose of being educated was to get free. And marginalized populations have always known that, right? Because if you're from a marginalized population, you don't have the luxury of thinking the purpose of education is just so you can make a lot of money and get a good job. Because you can't take for granted that you're going to make a lot of money or get a good job. So it has to be about communal uplift. But what we did in this country, when we integrated schools, we didn't integrate philosophies of schooling. That is the next step. Integrating that individualistic philosophy, which the dominant group rocks really easily, and it makes sense for us, with a more liberatory communal understanding. If we change the paradigm, if we change the narrative, if we change the stories that we tell about the very purpose for which education is constructed, then we can create a new society. We can create a new country. And we can generate the kind of leadership that we will need in the classroom and out of the classroom throughout the 21st century. Thank you all so very much for being here. I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.
Do we have a shirt or anything for him?
I don't think we were going to do Q&A. Okay. But I am going to have books to say.
Okay.
Great. Yeah. So I've been told that I finished early, which I've never done in history. So I'm told that we can do some questions, and I'm glad to do that if there are some. I also want to announce, and this is, I don't want to do this, but I have to do this.
Let me do it.
You do it. It's going to seem less tacky if you do it. You do it. Yeah, go ahead.
So, Tim, you've got books to sell?
I do. Fascinating.
Amazing. And my understanding is that they're outside.
They are.
Okay.
And once we're done here, I will totally take your money and sell you one.
All right, perfect. So there's going to be a crush of people wanting to buy your books. And let's take questions. Great.
Thank you. So I'm having a hard time seeing because the lights are like right in my eyes, but oh, you're at the mic, right? Excellent, excellent. We'll start there, and then if anybody, we'll start here, and then we'll come back there. Yes, go ahead.
Hi. Wow. Thank you so much. It was a very impressive speech.
Thank you.
So, Galina Gerasimova, AFT 2121, City College of San Francisco. My question is, what do you think about influence of eugenics on our understanding of the racial issues? And if we believe that people of color has lower IQ by their genes inherited, so that means we just have to drop our hands and do nothing about that. So there's a lot of critics who actually criticize the theory, but we still have all this research try to prove that it's true.
Right.
What do you think?
Well, I think this is also how understanding history and understanding precedent is very important. You know, sometimes we act amazed when someone comes up with those theories about race and IQ or class and IQ. There was all this uproar when the bell curve was released in '94, as there should have been. But it's not as if there wasn't a precedent for that. The idea that there are certain species, subspecies of mankind that are superior and others that are inferior has a long pedigree. During that same period that Woodrow Wilson was pontificating about education as an unequalizer, some of the leading academicians and thinkers in this country were in fact actively engaged not only in theorizing eugenic theories, but in actually sterilizing tens of thousands over the course of the 20th century, women of color, disproportionately indigenous peoples and African American women, and poor white women as well, under that theory. In fact, Adolf Hitler took many of his eugenic policies and notions of racial hygiene from American academicians and thinkers. So we are the seedbed of that kind of thinking, and it comes back around every few generations, right? And I think part of resisting inequality is that we've got to push back on those narratives very hard. Those of us who are white in particular have to challenge our brothers and sisters and colleagues and family members who are the ones who so readily fall into those ways of thinking. And all of us have got to do a better job talking about that history, because if we understand that history, if we understand the purpose for which that history was created, standardized tests, right, were initially created as a way to prove the inferiority of Jews and Italians, let alone people of color, just working class folks from Europe as well. That was their purpose. If we understand that they were created for that purpose, if we understand that eugenics and racial supremacy has been interwoven with not just our schooling, but our politics and economy since the very beginning, then we have a very different way of understanding what we see right now. Otherwise, we get shocked by it and can't believe somebody would still think like this. But they've always thought like that because it serves the interest of those at the top to say that those at the bottom are there because of something wrong with them, and thus we needn't do anything about it. Back in the back first, because I saw you first, then I'll come here, and then I'll go back there. So we'll do 4, 2, 3.
I'm going to make a request now for the third time. If we could turn down those lights. I don't know who's responsible, but we cannot see up here very well.
Hi.
You can see great, but we can't see great. So third time, still no lights going down, okay?
Not all the way down, but down enough, yeah, so they're not like that. We'll go to 4, then 2, then 3. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much.
You bet.
Joe Barry, also from AFT 2121 at City College San Francisco. First, I want to thank you. I followed your work and your writing for many years, and I appreciate the fact that somebody who's gotten a little older, a little gray in their beard, has not mellowed. I appreciate that. I want to thank you for that.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you to tell a little story that I know you know. I've heard you tell it before, about the origins of the racial system of white supremacy in the 1600s.
Sure.
If you tell that story a little bit, as an American history teacher and a labor history teacher, I know that even most teachers, in this room, may not know that story.
Right. Well, I'll tell a very brief version of it because I know we don't have a lot of time. When we look around and we see today in our politics a rich white man telling working class white people that their problem is brown people, we need to understand the historical pedigree of that. That is symbolic of the entire history of race and class politics in America. The history of rich white people telling working class and poor white people that their problem are black and brown people. So beginning in the 1600s, that is what happens. Prior to about 1670 or so, there was no such thing as the white race, at least not recognized as such, called as such. That is not what people of European descent were when they were in Europe. They were English, they were Irish, they were Scottish, they were whatever they were. They were not white. Only in the colonies do we become white, and for a very specific reason, because in those early years of the colonial period, where you had white indentured servants, one level above enslaved themselves, and you had African-descended folks, some of them enslaved for life, others indentured servants also in the earliest years of the colonies, those people would often see their interests as being common. They all realized that they were being screwed over by the same landowners, the same elite. They fomented various rebellions like Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, others as well. And as a result, the elite in the colonies realized that they had to figure out a way to get the other folks from Europe on their team. So they created this mentality that said, you're now a member of the white race, you're on our team, you're wearing our uniform. Now you're at the end of the bench, you may not get in the game, but you're on our team, you see. So then they start putting white folks, now called, on the slave patrols, right? Didn't really give them any land or any real power except the power to control people of color, which is why folks of color say, and they are right, that modern policing traces to the system of slave patrols and slavery, and we have to be clear on that because that's the history, right? So whiteness was created to divide and conquer, to create the notion that even though you might not have much, at least you're not black, at least you're not indigenous, at least you're not Mexican, at least you're not Chinese working on the railroads to build the transcontinental economy. You may not have much, but at least you have, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, the psychological wage of whiteness. And it's a trick that was played during the Civil War era on my people in the South, right? Rich folk, landowners in the South telling poor white folks who didn't own anything that they got to go out and fight to preserve the rich man's property in human beings. Fascinating. Why would you do that? Why would I go fight for your property? Well, because you told me that if I don't, these slaves are going to take my job. No, fool, they got your job. That's the point. If you got to charge $1 a day and you can make them work for free because you own them, guess who got the gig, Jack? Not you. So in fact, the system of enslavement was in the long run against the class interest of working class white folks, but they got suckered. Same thing happened in the union movement. You had white labor union folks who didn't want black and brown bodies in their union because it would reduce the professionalism of the craft. No, fool, it'll double the size of your union. And then when you go out on strike, they can't replace your happy ass with the brown folk that you didn't want next to you in the first place. Because when they do replace you with them, then you will blame them, not the elite. See how that works? It's a trick. And it has worked for hundreds of years. It is working on some folk right now. And it is our job to resist that with every fiber of our being. Number 2, right here.
I'm Mark Griffin from BCCE 6192 from Berkeley. I wanted you to speak a little bit more on the system, but you just spoke a lot just now. But I really am in a situation at my school district where it is all about systematically pushing kids from not having any self-esteem at all to pushing them even further down in the grave. So now they're going, we got what they call closing the achievement gap is when you're kicking out black and brown kids. That is not what we are all about. I think we're all here to educate kids. That's what we're here for, right? Okay, so when we're sitting in a situation where us as classified are trying to educate our kids well-balanced, not just about arithmetic and ABCs, it's about balance at home. Whether a parent is going to take care of a child, we're supposed to be teaming up with the parent. That's not happening. Right. Can you help me with that?
Right. Well, there's no doubt that we have to envision the role of education as more than this very limited frame that it currently is, where it's this subject and that subject and X number of credits in this and X number of credits in that. The state may tell you that that's the job. The federal government may tell us that that's the job. Your local community, your local school board, your local policymakers may. But I'm here to tell you, and it's the same thing that's happening right now in Tucson ever since La Raza Studies was eliminated. Those folks are on the one hand trying to get that program back because they want to educate in a balanced and real way and teach the young people what they need to know about the systems that affect their lives. But even as they are fighting for its restoration, they also realize that while the program is not fully restored, they've got to be teaching young people that on the weekends, in their homes, in their basement, at the park, at the community center, at the church, at the mosque. There's no way that the school system can tell you what you can and cannot tell children. They may limit what you can do between 8 and 3, but by God, on the weekend, they are yours, and you can begin to talk to them about liberation, and you can begin to talk to them about seeing education in a broader way. And that's what we're going to have to start doing as parents, as educators, and as concerned citizens. And so I suggest to you, it's frustrating. It's frustrating to continue to feel as though you're beating your head against a wall and you're not getting the kind of support that you need from those who make the laws and control the budgets to do all of the work that you need to do. But I'm here to tell you, some of that narrative that we share with young people, it doesn't take that much time and it doesn't take that much money. When that teacher in Cherry Creek did what he did with those young students in his math class, that was just one day, and he lit a fire under them because he made school relevant to them. I have a friend who started teaching several years ago, and I grew up with her, and we're both from Nashville, and she writes to me on Facebook. She's like 40 years old at that point. She's just getting ready to start teaching. She had just gotten her teacher certification from Hunter in New York City, and she was getting ready to be turned loose on the New York City public school system, right? So she writes me up. She says, "What do I need to know?" I was like, well, where are you going to be teaching? Now, before I tell you the answer she gave me, let me explain. This is a blonde, blue-eyed, former cheerleader. And this is not meant pejoratively. I'm just telling you this so that you understand when I tell you where they're sending her, it ain't that. So I say, "Where are they sending you?" And she says, "The South Bronx." And I said, "What neighborhood?" And she said, "Mott Haven." Okay, well, Mott Haven is the second poorest community in this country behind Pine Ridge Reservation. Median income of households the year that my friend was going to start teaching, $7,500 per year per household in income. And here's this nice white lady getting ready to roll up in Mott Haven to teach 8th grade. You know, this is worse than Michelle Pfeiffer in Dangerous Minds. Like, this is way worse, right? So she said, what do I need to know? I said, well, here's what you need to know. First of all, 8th grade is like the worst time to be alive on the planet. By the way, anyone in here that teaches 7th and 8th grade, God bless, because that's the hardest damn thing in the world. Right? So I said, here's what you got to do. You can't just go in and teach what's in that curriculum. You've got to go, because 8th grade's a hard time to be alive. They're going to try to eat you alive, not because they're bad kids, but that's what 8th graders do. Right? So you're going to walk in, they're going to have your number from the get. You're going to walk in there, they're going to look at you, and they're going to figure out how to make your life miserable. The only thing you can do is take the power back by going in, looking at them. I would put my name on the board, turn around, face the class, and go, I know this is some shit, right? And she said, what do you mean? I said, literally, just like you have to be self-deprecating. You got to make fun of yourself or they will do it for you. Because if you can signal to them that you know, I said, here's what you ought to do. Ask those kids the first day of school. Ask them, what do you think it says about the New York public school system that they wanted to send me, a thoroughly new teacher who's never been in a classroom even one day, into this neighborhood to teach you? What do you think that says about how they view you? And what do you think that says about how they view me? Because those children know the answer. Those children know that if the system really cared about them, they'd have sent the most experienced teacher into that school and paid them commensurate with their skill level. And they also know that if they cared about her, they wouldn't send her in there, because, see, that's the thing. The system doesn't care if she quits or if they learn. And I guarantee you, Kristen, this is what I told my friend, if you go in there and do that for 2 days, they will love you, and you will have a bond with them that will last all year long, because they will know that you are an ally in solidarity with them. That's the kind of stuff we can do. That doesn't take money, and it doesn't take much time. It takes a different mindset, and we can do that. Last question, number 3, and then I'm being told we got to go. Sorry about that. Yes.
Hi, I'm Sharon from BFT Local 1078. I'm actually a middle school teacher, and I love middle school students. They're awesome.
Excellent.
But every year we go through the same stressors. At the beginning of the year, our kids are just motivated and dynamic, and we do a great job with them. And then May comes along, and testing. I want to know what you feel, how we're going to stop the machine that's running our schools with Pearson, and what we should do as a district and as a state to stop that money machine from happening. Is opt out the option? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think it is, and I think we have to be bold and brave enough when we feel that we have the power to do so, or we feel empowered enough or brave enough to do so, to resist that testing regime, very much like what happened in Seattle. It's happened a few other places around the country. I know it's risky and I know it's frightening, but if folks stand together in that, if it's just 1 or 2 teachers doing it, then that's not going to work. But if it's 20 in a building, if it's 15 in a building, if it's everyone, if it's half the teachers in a building or a third of the teachers in a system, then I think the dynamic begins to change. So I think we need to learn from that struggle in Seattle. We also have to do a better job, I think, as long as this testing regime is in place. And it's going to take a lot of political work to try to undo that. And you can't do all of that in your own buildings, and you can't do that all in your own local systems. You can't even do all that at the state level. That's got to be a combined effort, local, state, and federal. But I think in the meantime, one of the things that we can do with our young folks is we may have to give them the test, but we don't have to lead them to believe that that test means anything, right? One of the things that I've seen with young people is that when you tell young people, when you ratify that this test is, pardon the expression, bullshit, right? The students know it. They know it's ridiculous, but they're being told that it means something. I think part of our job is to de-stress testing by talking to them about the real inadequacy of these things as measures of human worth. Because if they know that we know that, if they know that there are people who are asked to give these tests who think that they are as ridiculous as they, the students, do, a couple things happen. We know this from the research, right? When young people are more relaxed taking any kind of test, let alone a high-stakes test, they tend to do better. Right? Many years ago when the Princeton Review started doing SAT prep, I remember, they had an actual slogan. They used to put it on bus stops and on the sides of buses and in newspaper ads, and the expression was, the SAT is bullshit. And the whole thing that the Princeton Review did, and still does, right, is their attitude is, we're not just going to drill you on how to do well on the SAT and teach you a bunch of words and math concepts. I mean, there'll be some of that, but mainly what we're teaching you is the game. right? That this is all a game constructed by somebody else, probably someone who's never been a teacher, someone who's never been a professional educator, someone who doesn't know anything about real learning. So we're going to teach you how to game the game. We're going to teach you how to play the game better than the people who write the game. And all of a sudden, the students started doing better coming through that system than through traditional test prep, because it was a system that was saying, this isn't real, this is all nonsense. And if we look at it that way, we can undo it, we can unravel its logic. So even though we're trying to get this testing regime nationally overturned and changed, in the meantime, we need to be making sure that our young people know that this is not a measure of who they are. It's not a measure of what kind of student they are. It's not a measure of what kind of human being they are. And it's not a measure of what they can do to change this system themselves with our help. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Hey, Tim, before you go, we have parting gifts.
Brothers and sisters, one of the central aspects of WISE is curricula which are tailored to economic demands rather than personal growth. Remember, in today's schools, there is a heavy emphasis on STEM subjects, test taking, and job-ready skills that corporations want, missing the cultivation of creativity, civic engagement, or deep historical understanding. For corporations, the goal is efficiency. Workers who can operate machines, code software, or perform service roles without questioning the deeper injustice of the system. For Black communities, this is a continuation of a long-standing pattern where their education was never meant to empower but to keep them confined to roles that sustain the economic order. Right, so that's a really, really important point that I really noted while I was listening to this speech. Also, this becomes even clearer when we consider the historical roots of Black education in America. During slavery, enslaved Africans were often forbidden from learning to read and write when they were allowed some form of education after emancipation. It was often vocational and deliberately limited. The philosophy of Booker T's Washington Tuskegee Institute, for instance, was shaped by white elites who believed that Black people should be trained mainly in manual labor to serve industrial needs rather than to be educated for leadership or intellectual development. Dr. Tim Wise also connects these to today's corporate-driven schooling, where Black children are often tracked into practical, low-paying labor fields, while wealthier white children are groomed for leadership roles. Talking about the standardized tests is another tool corporations and elites use to shape education to their needs. Tim Wise and others argue that these tests do not measure intelligence or creativity, but rather it conforms and the ability to memorize. Corporations and universities then use the metrics to filter who is worthy of opportunity. And historically, Black students score lower on these tests because of lack of ability. Not because of lack of ability, but because the tests are culturally biased and linked to unequal schooling resources. This ensures that Black students are more likely to be funneled into lower-paying jobs, perpetuating the cycle of economic exploitation. Also, corporate influence in education is also evident in the way schools are funded. In the US, schools largely rely on local property taxes for funding, which means wealthier, which are often white, neighborhoods have better resourced schools, while poorer, which are often Black communities, are underfunded. This design ensures that corporations and elites get what they need: a two-tiered education system where one class is prepared to rule and innovate while the other is prepared to serve. Instead of education being a great equalizer, as he said, it becomes a sorting mechanism that locks people into predetermined roles. Also, Dr. Tim Wise also highlights how discipline in schools mirrors the corporate and prison systems. Black students, in particular, are disproportionately punished for minor infractions, suspended or expelled. This call to prison pipeline teaches them from an early age that obedience is more important than curiosity, and that they psychologically, and this prepares them psychologically not for freedom and self-development, but for submission to authority, be it in low-wage jobs or within the criminal justice systems. Corporations benefit from this because they get a workforce conditioned to obey rather than to resist. Also, another dimension is how the content of education is stripped of the truth to serve corporate and elite narratives. History lessons often sanitize slavery, colonialism, and racial violence while glorifying capitalism and American exceptionalism. This ideological training ensures students grow up internalizing myths that justifies inequality. For Black people, this means that being taught a version of history that downplays their oppression and erases their contribution, leaving them disempowered and discontinued from their own heritage. Corporations prefer this kind of a worker, one who does not question why poverty exists or wealth is concentrated at the top. In addition to that, corporations increasingly shape the direction of higher education. Universities rely on corporate funding for research, pushing students into fields profitable to companies while cutting programs in the humanities that focus on critical thinking, philosophy, or history. Black students who already face economic barrier are steered into debt-heavy degrees that do not guarantee upward mobility. Instead of producing empowered thinkers who might challenge the status quo, the system produces indebted graduates desperate for any job, making them easier to control. Also, Dr. Wise stresses that this system is not accidental. It is by design education in America, especially for Black communities, which has always been a tool of social engineering. From slave codes that banned literacy to Jim Crow laws that underfunded Black schools to present-day reforms that emphasize testing and conformity. The purpose has been to serve the elite economy. What has changed is only the method. Now, corporations openly influence what is taught, how is taught, and what outcomes they reward. Ultimately, the corporate capture of education turns a tool of liberation into a tool of control. Instead of producing citizens who can think critically about democracy, justice, and community, the system produces workers who keep corporations profitable. For Black people, this is simply a continuation of the old pattern where the education is designed to keep them in subordinate roles. Dr. Wise's point is that unless education is reclaimed for self-development and empowerment, America will remain a society where corporations dictate not just the economy, but the very minds of the citizens. I'm your host and presenter, Jidok Stories. But until then, really let me know what you think about this video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.